and hope. But one of the things that's really important that I try to always remember also to share about is that, I know a lot of us get to Alcoholics Anonymous more so these days than when I first came in, but I don't really think it matters how we get to Alcoholics Anonymous as long as we get here. But I think that sometimes along the path, some of the things that happen before people get to Alcoholics Anonymous can get a little murky. So I want to clear up a couple things about Alcoholics Anonymous in case you came here from some other path on your way here. And what that would be is that Alcoholics Anonymous is absolutely free. Had Alcoholics Anonymous not been free, I never could have come here. Had Alcoholics Anonymous not remained free, I never could have stayed here. I was well over 10 years sober in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous before I could afford to put $1 in the basket at the seventh tradition on anything like a regular basis. So this is not about money. And like I said, I know some of us get here in different ways and we have to pay money in order to find Alcoholics Anonymous, but I want you to be very clear that this is not about money. I love Alcoholics Anonymous and I love conventions. And one of the reasons that I love conventions is I like getting together and meeting a lot of people from a lot of different areas and finding out how things are going in their area and the different actions and activities that they're doing. And I strongly encourage those of you who are new at this conference, if you live near here or if you live near where the next one is, that you find some people that are going to be on those committees and that you get involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's been a really important aspect of my sobriety, and I think that it's changed my life being active and meeting some of those people that have helped me so much by their example. I believe I was born an alcoholic because, like I said, there was something wrong with me. My earliest memories, which go back to really about 5, from that time, I always wanted to die. And I prayed about dying. At that time, I began to try and kill myself. I began to take overdoses of baby aspirin. That was all I knew about. I used to cut my hands and fingers and wrists with razor blades. I used to beat and burn my body from about that age. And when I look back on that time in my life and on the times before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I can tell you that I never liked anything about myself. I never liked being tall. I never liked being skinny. I didn't like being from Venice. I didn't like living in the alcoholic home that I lived in. I didn't like going to the school that I was going to. I didn't like having the family that I had. And most of all, I never, for one instant, liked the way that I felt. And so for someone like me, I am extremely grateful that I found alcohol and some of the chemicals that I was to mix with it while I was out there, because I needed them desperately. I began to drink on a regular basis when I was 8 years old. I had already been using drugs for almost a year at that time. And when I found alcohol, I began to mix it most of the time with something called barbiturates or downers or reds or yellows, whatever you might know them as. And the combined effect of those got me where I needed to go. I don't have an exciting drunk-a-log. I've never had a social drink in my life. I never wanted one. If you drank the way that I drank, you don't have a very exciting story either. I passed out, I threw up, I overdosed, and that was really about all that I did, before I came to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And, a lot of people in Alcoholics Anonymous will share about the fact that for many years, they had a lot of fun. And they had a lot of good times with their drinking. But that is not the story, that's mine. What happened for me is alcohol didn't make me feel good, and it didn't make me a party girl. Alcohol made me not feel anything at all, and that's what I so desperately needed. It was the only time when I could shut the pain down just a little bit. Now, I guess because, maybe we're all kind of curious, and I would look back on those times after I got sober, trying to figure out kind of what was going on. And I don't certainly really know. I mean, I've seen psychiatrists, I've seen psychologists in my life. I don't have any kind of a diagnosis from them because I always felt about those people like my friend Patty Hicks did, which I thought they should have to work for their money, so I never told them anything. I sat there the required 50 minutes. I never answered one question. I never filled out one form. I never played with one doll. I had nothing to say to those people. But when I was growing up, they would ask what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I said I wanted to be a boy, and that wasn't as easy to do back then as it is today, and it caused a great deal of concern in my family. And eventually my mom, my family were and are very active in Catholicism, and they began to take me to priests for counseling, and then we were on welfare a great deal of time, so I had access to seeing psychologists and psychiatrists, and I was taken to these people to try and find out, why I was trying to kill myself or why I felt the way that I did or whatever. But as I said, I really don't have any kind of a diagnosis. I know that as I look back on it today that part of what it was for me was that when I was growing up, before coming to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I never saw a man cry. Now, I've seen men stabbed, I've seen them arrested, I've seen them beaten up, I've seen their wives leave, I've seen their kids overdose, I've seen a lot of different things happen in people's lives. I never saw a man cry under any of those circumstances. I saw the women in my life go through each and every one of those circumstances. Some of them didn't cry, but most of them did at one point or another. They had a breaking point. And I looked at those two different groups of people and I decided immediately which one I wanted to be like. And I wanted to be a guy. Because I thought that way I wouldn't have to feel anything, because I didn't think men felt any pain. I thought the only emotion that men experienced was anger and rage. And that was acceptable to me. I just didn't want to feel any of that pain girl stuff, And I had this very severe problem, though, which I've heard Clancy, talk about it at different times, which was that I seemed to have been one of those people who was born without any insulation whatsoever for my emotions. So that when I began to go to school at about 5 years old, and those kids would look at me or whisper or tease me about being tall or skinny or whatever it was, I felt like I was being cut up inside with knives that hurt so bad. And these were absolute strangers. I had no emotional, insulation whatsoever. And I would start to cry, or I would want to start to cry. And so I found out about myself from the very earliest memory that I had that I was the thing that I hated the most in the entire world. I was weak. And I never forgave myself for it. And I never forgave anybody else for it either. If I saw weakness, I wanted to be as far away from you as possible. If I saw any kind of a human emotion with the exception of anger or rage, I didn't want to be anywhere near you. I didn't want to be in the same room. I thought, someone might think I was like that. And alcohol allowed me to try to be the kind of person that I wanted to be, to not care, to have things not matter. And I spent my life, I always knew in my life that I had no tolerance for emotional pain. So I spent a great deal of my life before coming to Alcoholics Anonymous trying to make sure that people were much more likely to punch me in the face than they were to hurt my feelings. And I was fairly successful at that. I walked around a lot, with black eyes and bloody lips and scars on my face. And that was just sort of the way that I interacted with other human beings. In growing up somewhere along the line, I had to realize that I wasn't going to be able to be this boy, or a boy. And so I had to settle for the next best thing. And the way that I saw the world, the only option for someone like me was to try and be a tough broad. And I grew up in a town called Venice, California, and it's a beach town. And I know today, since I've traveled, a lot in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I've met a lot of other tough broads, that some of the things that go along with that are have geographical, locale things, that kind of go with it. So if you're in Venice and you want to be a tough broad, it's very important that you not wear shoes. Tough broads at the beach do not wear shoes, and so that was important. It was important to me at the time that I'd be in a gang. Tough broads were in gangs, and I was in a gang. It was important that you do a lot of fighting, and I did a lot of fighting. It's important that I always remember to share about the fact that I've never won a fight in my life. But I've never fought less than 5 people at a time. And after I'd been sober for a while, my sponsor explained to me that the reason, that I always fought groups of 5 or more is if you fight one person and you lose, someone might be able to say that you're not a very good fighter. But if you always fight groups of 5 or more, no one expects you to win. And some people actually think you might be kind of tough, or why would that many people have had to jump you? And so I was always kind of able to try and arrange these sort of things. It was important, that you smoke, and I did a lot of smoking. I would stand down there in Venice Beach on the boardwalk with my cigarette, barefoot, looking at the touristy-looking people as they walked by. And when I saw them looking at me, I would take my cigarette and I would throw it down on the boardwalk and I would put it out with my bare feet. And I'd see those people whisper back and forth to each other. I knew what they were saying. They were saying, "Wow, that is one tough broad." And I was very impressed that I could do these things, and I knew they were even more impressed Again, after I'd been sober for a while, my sponsor explained to me that perhaps what some of those people were saying to one another was, "Did you see that? That person just put flesh to fire." Now, why would anybody do anything so stupid? But I didn't know there was another way of looking at it. I only, had that one perspective. Anyway, I grew up in an alcoholic home. There was a lot of violence in my home. There was a lot of different kinds of abuse and a lot of broken promises and a lot of the same kind of things that go on in many other alcoholic homes. And I didn't see alcoholism as a disease. I saw it as a weakness. And I've already given you an indication of what I thought about weak people and weaknesses. And I had no tolerance whatsoever for it. So I tried to stay as far away from my mother and her alcoholism and the repercussions that were coming down as I could. My mother began to come to Alcoholics Anonymous many years before I got sober, and she was in and out of Alcoholics Anonymous for many, many years. And today, I really don't know that I could say that my mother is a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't believe that my mother has been in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous for over 10 years, but she does not drink. But anyway, my mother, and I knew about Alcoholics Anonymous long before I came here, and I didn't really have much interest in it, certainly. I didn't really think it works very well, because my mom was drinking, it seemed to me, just as much as she had before she started going to Alcoholics Anonymous. But she would have these little periods of sobriety. But anyway, I was in and out of the house at different foster homes and different locations and different family members and things. And finally, this one particular time I came back, and I was living with my mother for a very short period of time that I had been home. And my mom brought me to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous that night. And she didn't bring me because I asked for help, and she didn't bring me because I admitted having a problem. She just brought me because she thought if she left me alone, I might get her evicted from another apartment. And I went into that meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I did not raise my hand, and I did not believe that I had a problem. But the miracle of this program began for me that night, even though I didn't get sober then. And it began for me because there was a guy there at that meeting that I admired more than anybody else in the whole world. And I admired this guy for a lot of reasons, and many of you may not identify with the things that I admired about him, but they were the reasons that I actually came back to Alcoholics Anonymous. I admired Paul because he was from my town in Venice. He was actually a drinking friend of my mother's. And he'd been in jail, he'd been in prison, he had tattoos, he rode a motorcycle, he had a knife and had it with him at the meeting that night. And I looked at him and I thought, wow, I just didn't think people that tough came to AA. I thought it was just for weak people like my mom. And if I had to tell you what I wanted out of life in one sentence, when I had come through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous, all I wanted the ability to walk into a room full of strangers and have everyone there back away from me in terror. Now, when you're 87 pounds, that almost never happens, But that was what I wanted out of life. And this guy, Paul, who, like I said, was a drinking friend of my mom's, I'd seen him in a lot of bars, and I'd seen him in a lot of different places, And he was the kind of guy where if he'd been drinking and he wanted to sit at your table, you just gave him the whole table. Because he didn't know what he might do to get the table, And so I looked at this guy who had achieved everything that I wanted out of life. The ability to clear rooms and tables, and he was sitting in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it made a big impression on me. I got drunk the next night, and then I came back to some meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. I did not raise my hand, because I didn't believe I was an alcoholic, and even if I had been, I wasn't going to join an organization that was allowing my mother to be a part of it. So I just kind of, went to the meetings. And I didn't really talk to anybody, except Paul. He was the only person that I felt was cool enough here that I would, speak to. And in between the meetings and after the meetings, I would explain to Paul, I'd say, I'm not an alcoholic. I'm not anything like my mother, who's really severely alcoholic. I'm just not an alcoholic. I'm far too young to be an alcoholic. I have places to go, I have people to see, I have things to do, I have my whole life ahead of me, and I am clearly not alcoholic. Now, I later learned that non-alcoholics don't have to spend any time trying to convince other people that they're not alcoholics. They already know that. But Paul turned to me and he said, June, I'm pretty new in this AA thing. He said, and they tell me I can't diagnose anybody's disease but my own. He said, but in your case, I'm going to make an exception. He said, I've seen the way that you drink and I've seen the way that you mix chemicals. And he said, and I happen to believe if you don't come into this program and take what these people have to offer you, within a period of 6 months or less, you're going to be out on the streets, you're going to be shooting stuff, and you're going to be selling your ass. And he wasn't trying to scare me like the teacher in high school might make up some stories to scare the kids or something. He was just talking about facts. He was talking about things that had happened and were beginning to happen in my life. But I did not want to be an alcoholic. I did not want to join Alcoholics Anonymous. And yet in that 2-week period of time, as I attended those meetings and talked to Paul, every option but Alcoholics Anonymous was removed from my life. I've already mentioned, that I hated myself and didn't like anything about myself. But by the time I got to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, the only person I hated more than my mother was myself. And I hated my mother for everything that had ever gone wrong in my life. And take it from me, the short version, a lot had gone wrong. And in the course of my life, I had a lot of anger and I had a lot of rage. And one of the people that I most often took it out on was my mother. And I used to physically attack her, and she would physically attack me, and we would have these altercations. And at that time, my mom was getting sober again in Alcoholics Anonymous, and she didn't think she had to be attacked in her own apartment, and she asked me to leave, and I did. The rest of my family, I was not allowed to call or come by under any circumstances. They didn't want anything to do with me, and I didn't bother trying. I had been in a lot of foster homes. I'd been thrown out of all of them, and I knew none of them wanted me back either. And I thought, well, you know what? Who cares? Who cares about the family, and those foster homes and all that, because that's not really important. The only thing that matters if you're a tough broad is your gang. That's all that's really important. And then one day as I walked down an alley, all 5 members of my own gang beat me up. And I found myself sitting in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I was 87 pounds. I had a black eye. I had a swollen lip. I had no family. I had no money. I had no place to live. I had no shoes. I wouldn't have worn shoes at the time if I had them, but I didn't have them. And I raised my hand in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And you could see where it was really kind of simple. It wasn't like, would you like to go to Hawaii or join AA? I mean, it was just a much easier decision than that. And, when I began to raise my hand at those meetings, there were some people who I know today did not know about the traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous, in particular the third tradition, the one that says the only requirement for AA membership is the desire to stop drinking. And the reason I know that those people did not know about that tradition today is because some of those people through my mother knew how old I was. And they came over to me after the meeting when I raised my hand, and they told me that I was too young to be an alcoholic. And they told me if I came back to their meetings that they'd get together and throw me out. And I didn't know that Alcoholics Anonymous had a set of traditions that said no one could throw me or anybody else out of a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I just figured they didn't want me either. And that was okay with me, because I didn't want me either. And I had it for a long, long time. And I fell back on my number one answer, the answer I'd been using since I was 5 years old. And I went over to a friend of my mother's house, and I went into her bathroom, which is the first place I went at anyone's house I ever visited. And when I got there into that bathroom, I found enough pills to kill myself, and I took enough of them to do it. And that day before I passed out, I went to a noon meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And by the time I got to that meeting, I could not sit and I could not stand. I was laying in the meeting. Now, I don't know about where you guys go to meetings, out here, but where I got sober in West Los Angeles, they almost never call on people to share who are laying in the meeting. For some reason, they did call on me that day, and they knew from that I needed to be in a hospital, and that's where I came to. And a doctor gave me medication to make me throw up. And then he explained to me that the pills I had taken were to slow down my heart. And I really, and he just said, if it had been 5 or 10 minutes later, you probably would have been in a coma that we couldn't have brought you out of. Now, I don't know why that overdose was any different than any of the others that I inflicted upon myself during the years that I was out there. I just know that from that time on, one day at a time, I haven't taken anything that affects me from the neck up, and that's how I personally define sobriety. Now, that was the 12th of July of 1972, so my sobriety date is July 13th, 1972. I want you to know, especially if you're new, that I never planned on staying sober in Alcoholics Anonymous for 26 years. I want you to know that at that time, and for many, many months afterwards in Alcoholics Anonymous, if they had given me a choice of whether I wanted to live or not, I would have checked the no box. I'm not one of the people that stayed in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous because I was afraid if I went back out there on the streets I might die. I tried to die as long and as hard as I could out there, and I didn't make it. So what kept me in my seat in Alcoholics Anonymous was I was afraid I'd be able to go back out there and live the way that I had been living. And by the time I got in the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous, I could not have gone on breathing in and out 3 more times with as much as I hated myself. It was absolutely impossible. I think back, when I came into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, there were a lot of people who were very kind. A lot of very kind members of Alcoholics Anonymous. And there were a lot of people who really did try to help me. But I was not able or willing to accept that kind of kindness. And I'm very, very grateful to the people who were here in Alcoholics Anonymous when I got here, and to the people who tolerated me the way that I was when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. I came to Alcoholics Anonymous with a bad attitude. I don't want you to think I developed a bad attitude here. I simply came here with the only attitude I had ever had, and it had always been bad. I did not like women. I had never liked women. I didn't want to sit next to women. I did not want to shake hands with women. I most certainly was not going to hug women. And I did not like listening to women speakers, which is something that always makes me feel better, because I know there are never as many people listening to me as it looks like. The only men I had ever known in my life were extremely violent. Most of them were alcoholics. Figured you guys in here were alcoholic, and that's the way you were too. And so the men in Alcoholics Anonymous scared me. I didn't want anything to do with them either. And so I had a problem, because in July of 1972, when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, all we had were men and women, and I didn't like any of them. And most of all, I didn't like meat. And I wanted to do everything that I could to be sure that no one would get near me. I didn't wear shoes most of the first couple of years that I was sober. I wore motorcycle chains on my wrists and ankles. I had a jacket that on the back said, "Do unto others and then split." Kind of my own little spiritual slogan. I smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and I lit all of them myself. Occasionally someone would hold a match for me, and I allowed them to hold it as long as they liked, but they never lit my cigarette with it. After I'd been sober a little while, I took up smoking cigars and then a pipe. I had a very limited vocabulary when I came to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. It consisted almost solely of profanity. There were a few exceptions, the, and, mother. And there were a lot of people in Alcoholics Anonymous who were extremely offended by the type of language that I used, and so I tried to use it more when they got near me. And what I want to tell you is that if you choose to act that way, to dress that way, and to smoke that way, you too can sit in a fairly large meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous and have an entire row all to yourself. And I don't blame those people at all for staying away from me, which was exactly what I was hoping that, that most of them would do. But what I did do is I became very active in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous immediately. And I went to 21 meetings a week most of my first 2 years of sobriety. I had a commitment at almost every single one of those meetings. I remember one of my commitments was at the Tuesday night, 2+2, the Westwood group. I was the greeter. And I would stand there, barefoot, my jacket, cigars and chains, welcoming the newcomers as they came to AA. When I first got sober, people who didn't know me were guessing my age at 37 years old. And I was 13 at the time. And I would stand there and I would shake hands with the new people, and sometimes I'd hear their sponsor whisper, "See, if you keep drinking, you can end up like that," But I kept my commitments in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I was involved with the Monday Night Venice group, and it was a very, very active group, and we learned a lot about the traditions, and we did a lot of service work. And I had some place to be every single day and night. And I didn't go to 21 meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous because I wanted to get a gold star. I went to 21 meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous because I had absolutely no place else to go. And most of my life was spent getting to those meetings. A lot of the time I walked. Sometimes I hitchhiked. And if I had enough money, I took a bus. Because, believe it or not, there weren't countless people lining up to see if I'd like a ride, And I just sort of felt like I had to do things myself, but eventually I was able to, to become a part of a group and to get rides, with other people. When I got sober, I didn't, it seemed to me in Alcoholics Anonymous that other people got sober, and after, 30 days or maybe 90 days, if they'd had a really tough time. After about 90 days, they were their own best friends. They liked themselves, and their families were reunited for all the holidays. And that was sort of how it seemed to me as I sat in meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that was not the way that it was for me. When I got sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, the longer I stayed sober, the more conscious I was of the hatred that I had always had for myself. So that sometimes it was hard for me to sit in a meeting just breathing in and out. I hated myself so much. And I hated the places that I had been and the things that I had done. And you know, I learned too as I traveled that there are different kinds of tough broads. There are makeup wearing tough broads, and there are non-makeup wearing tough broads. And I was a non-makeup wearing tough broad because there had never been a time where I could imagine looking in a mirror long enough to have been able to put makeup on. In fact, you know, in the early weeks and stuff of my sobriety, when I sat in meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, with the hate and disgust that I felt for myself. And I listened to people stand up here and share about somewhere as they had, you know, begun to practice these principles and to live a different way of life, that somehow they had become their own friend and they had gained the respect of themselves and other people. I believed people in Alcoholics Anonymous. I found hope here right away. I never believed that it would work for me to the degree that it had worked for them. But I did believe that if I did these things, and if I went to 21 meetings a week, and if I really, really, really tried, that maybe someday, as I walked down the street and I happened to look in one of those storefront windows where you can't help but see your own reflection, that maybe I wouldn't feel like throwing up at what I saw looking back. And that was enough hope for me to keep coming to Alcoholics Anonymous. Not that I would someday like myself, but just that someday I wouldn't want to throw up at who I was and where I had been. And so I just, you know, I kept going to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't take baths or showers for a while when I got to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Some of that had to do with the fact that I didn't know how often people did those kind of things. You know, I never stood around with my gang saying, hey, do you use Crest or Colgate? You know, it just wasn't, I didn't know. You know, and I didn't want to look stupid because I figured everybody else knew how often you wash your face and what you do with those kind of things, you know. But I just kept going to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's what I did. I was unable and unwilling to go back to school. I tried it. My sponsor wanted me to try it, and I did try, and it just didn't work out very well. You know, they wanted me to wear shoes, take my chains off. It was really a problem for me, you know, and expand my vocabulary. They had a lot of requirements. So I wasn't doing very well in that regard. And so my sponsor told me that I had to go ahead and get the kind of jobs that people with 7th grade educations get if I wasn't willing to do the footwork to finish my education. And that's what I did. And I was lucky because I was able to get jobs where I could work a lot of crazy hours, you know, swing shift or, not swing shift, but graveyard shift or split shift in the daytime so that I could get to all these meetings, which is where I felt that I needed to be. And I was a terrible employee. I was a total flake. I got fired many, many times. But I kept my AA commitments. You know, that's all that I can tell you about in those early years of sobriety. At my home group, they would say it was really important that you get the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And not at every meeting in Los Angeles, but at my home group, they say it's really important that you get a copy of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. This is where you're going to find out about the program. And we sell it at exactly what we pay for it. And if you don't have enough money to buy it, then you can take it home and we'll give you credit arrangements. And if you're too afraid to arrange that or talk to somebody, you can just go ahead and steal it. Well, I've been stealing longer than I've been drinking, and I saw no reason to give that up. It was an unrelated activity as far as I was concerned. But I was somewhat superstitious, and I just didn't feel right about stealing an AA book from a meeting. So instead I went to the library and I stole the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous from the library. And while I was there, I stole a copy of the 12 and 12 because I heard a lot of people talking about that. I thought it might have some good stuff in it too. And you know, after I'd been sober for a while, I realized that I needed to make amends. And I took these 2 library books along with about 30 or 40 others that I'd had over the years, great classics like Misty the Seahorse, the things you steal when you're 6 and 7 years old if you go to the library. And I took these books and I explained to the librarian in Culver City that I was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous and that it was necessary for my sobriety that I return these books. And then I wanted to know if I could make payments because I'd had some of the books for, 11 years and they wanted like 3 to 5 cents a day, And she said that was fine, I could make payments, and she said that it was really kind of funny though. She said that she'd worked in this library in Laguna Beach, and this man had come in who'd stolen the big book and returned it, and she said, you guys must do this all the time. And it was just another indication that I'm really not unique. I haven't found anything in Alcoholics Anonymous that I've experienced that someone else hasn't already experienced and gone ahead and stayed sober through. After I'd been sober for a while, my sponsor found a program where I could go to like a trade school thing and learn how to be a secretary. Now, if there's anything in my life I never wanted to be, it was a secretary. There's hardly any tough bribes that do that. But that's what Gail wanted me to go ahead and try and do, and so I began to show up one day at a time as best as I could to start and type. And I started out, I was typing 17 words a minute with 9 errors. And I went to that school, I think, for 14 months. It was a really long time. And at the end of that, I was typing 37 words a minute with 19 errors. I mean, I just could not do typing, But during that time, I got an equivalency to a high school diploma, and now it was time for me to go out and look for a job. And I was a couple years sober at that time. I was maybe 2.5 years sober, and now they were talking about, going out to look for what I called a citizen-y type job. Now, I didn't know many citizen-y type people. This is where you go in an office and you work Monday through Friday in the daytime. And, I didn't know how to dress like those people. I didn't feel like I knew how to talk like those people. And I certainly knew I wasn't as good as those people. But the people in Alcoholics Anonymous, and by this time I was able to talk with women, and they gave me some clothes, and some of them, took me over to the Salvation Army, and they helped me buy a few things, and they told me the way that you kind of, what you wear, and, how you dress up a little bit, and they sent me out on these interviews, and I went on what seemed like hundreds of interviews. And to me, it felt like, look at the little Venice broad dressed up in the citizen costume, as I walked in, and I felt it was very painful, it was very difficult. But I'd been taught in Alcoholics Anonymous to just try and show up, and that was the best that I could do, And after a while, I don't know how many of these I filled out and, went on. I finally, I got a job. It was in an insurance company. I knew my sponsor would be thrilled. It was very square. And I went to work, and I worked really, really hard, and on the 8th day they called me in. I thought maybe they were going to give me a raise and a promotion, and she said, "I'm sorry, we're going to have to let you go." She said, you just don't have enough experience. And she said, and not only that, dear, you don't seem to have any common sense whatsoever. Now, I didn't know what common sense was, but I knew I was being insulted, And I didn't have a car still. I went downstairs, and I called the Los Angeles Central office. Because I'd been going to meetings for over 2 years at this point, and I had never heard of anyone sober being fired, and I did not think we'd allow things like that to happen, And I reported them. I thought we'd picket or something. And they just kind of laughed, and somebody over at Central Office came over and picked me up, and I just kind of helped over there and sorted literature and answered the phone for a while, and I just couldn't believe that this was happening, and at the same time after this I had to go out now and look for another job, and this certainly didn't help my confidence, and I didn't like anything about myself anyway, and now I didn't have common sense either, so anyway, I went ahead, and this woman called me up, in my group, and she said that there was a bank downtown interviewing. I thought that was rather funny. I mean, I had, been a thief all my life. I'd never even been in a bank. And I had never been downtown, which is only about 5 miles from, where I lived. And she drove me downtown for an interview, and I went on several interviews with this bank. And, I got to the part when I was filling out the application where it said, due to the fact that as a bank employee, it's necessary that you be bonded, we're going to do a thorough background check. And I thought, oh no, not me. I mean, I don't want anyone looking at my past. I mean, first of all, they call one library, and I have had it, But I went ahead and I turned it in and I filled out the form, and it turned out that they hired me. And not only did they hire me to work in a bank, they put me to work in the vault. And I didn't even know if AA worked that good, But I was able to stay there, and I didn't steal anything, and I showed up one day at a time. And during that time, I'd gotten tired of not being able to read. I knew, I don't think that's exactly the right way to say it. I had always been able to read, but up to that point still, I was not able to read like a paragraph and remember what it was saying, even in the big book. I just had the worst retention, and that had not always been the way that it was for me. And they had this city college nearby, and they had what they called a dummy English class. And one night I signed up and I began to take that class. And I took another class while I was there. And I just kept showing up there like I'd been taught to do, in my group. And I tried to do the homework as best I could, and I graduated. Not graduated. I completed those classes a couple of 6 months later. And I ended up getting laid off at that bank, and I got an opportunity to get a job on campus. I was able to get 2 jobs. I worked in the cafeteria sometimes, and I worked in the library sometimes, and that allowed me to take more classes. And I began to take more classes like, a history class and things that I had never taken and didn't know anything about. And I just began, I just kept showing up and going to my, my group and keeping my AA commitments and trying to do the best that I could. Now, when I used to stand at the door greeting people at 2+2, someone in my early months of sobriety, someone would walk up and they'd say, "Hi, I'm Mary," and I'd say, "Hi, I'm June," and someone else would walk up and say, "Hi, I'm Kathy," and at that point, I couldn't remember whether my name was Mary, Kathy, or June. It was just too much for me. And that's part of why I had, trouble going to school, But by this time, I went and I worked really, really hard. And at the end of 2 years, they called me, or 3 actually. At the end of 3 years, they called me into the counselor's office and they told me I'd completed all the requirements for an AA college degree. I thought that was a nice name for a college degree. I never wanted a college degree. It wasn't even on my list when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. And yet I was just amazed that this had been possible. I had never gone to school 5 days in my life before coming to Alcoholics Anonymous or after. I had never been able to hold a job even after sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous. And yet here I was, I had finished all these requirements. And when I graduated from that college, I graduated third in my class out of over 400 students. And, there wasn't any doubt in my mind that this was not because I was so smart or anything else. It was just very clear to me that only Alcoholics Anonymous could have taken someone who came from where I came from, where I was having a little trouble remembering which name was mine, and making it possible that I could show up and walked down there to pick up this diploma. And when I graduated, both of my sponsors were there, and several of my friends were there, and some of the members of my family that I was beginning to have a relationship with came as well. And I went ahead and I continued. I wanted to continue going to school because I had a dream at this time, and I went ahead and I filled out these applications, and my sponsor told me if I wanted my dream to come true, I had to do the same footwork that anyone in or out of Alcoholics Anonymous had to do. And so I went ahead and I continued, and I graduated from a university a couple of years later. And then I did some more footwork toward this dream. And I sent away those applications, and my goodness, it's been a really long time now, probably 15 years at least. And I received a telegram telling me I'd been chosen as one of 300 out of 3,000 applicants to go to law school. Now I'll tell you, I always planned on spending a lot of time in court, but never on that side of the table. And I was absolutely amazed that Alcoholics Anonymous could have made it possible for me to get into law school. And I still am. It's just not possible for someone like me. I went ahead and I went to law school, and it was still really, really hard. And it wasn't just hard intellectually. It was still very hard for me emotionally, or whatever way you want to call it. I still didn't like anything really about myself. I still wished I'd come from someone else's family a lot of the time. I still wished I had someone else's hair. I wished I wasn't as tall. I wished I was stacked. I wished a lot of things, at different times, just depending on what time of day you wanted to ask me what my wish was, And yet, I was very active still in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And at one point in this time, and it was actually before this, and this was a big turning point for me, I was at the Palm Springs Convention where my sponsor had a commitment every year. And I was down there, and she'd gotten me a ticket at a banquet, because I usually couldn't afford to go to the banquet, and so I was sitting at the banquet, and someone had given me a dress, and I was sitting there wearing my dress at the banquet. And as I sat there, comparing myself to everyone else in the room, something I still do on days when I'd like to feel miserable, I was sitting there doing that, and I was looking around, and I thought, I'm really glad I'm wearing this brown dress. I thought, what are you kidding? I talked to myself, I don't know about any of you, but what are you kidding? It's like, no, I like this brown dress. This is nice. I'm glad I'm wearing it. I thought, well, wait a minute. You gotta be kidding here. What about What about the green? I mean, green is your favorite color, right? Don't you wish you were wearing that green dress over there? Is that a beautiful dress? I thought, yeah, that is a beautiful dress. Don't you wish you were wearing it? No. I'm glad I'm wearing this brown dress. And then I started to ask myself other questions, you know. And as I sat there, I realized I wanted to just be tall and skinny and have curly red hair. I even wanted to be from Venice. You know, I didn't wish I had anybody else's mother. I didn't wish I came from anybody else's town. I didn't wish I had anybody else's home group. I didn't wish I was dating anybody else's guy. Just right at that moment as I sat there at that table, you know, and I didn't have a date. I didn't even wish I had a date for that moment. You know what I mean? It was just like one of those times. But more important than any of that, and for someone who comes from where I came from, that's a big deal already. For the very first time in my entire life, I wanted to feel like I was feeling. And I'll tell you, when I walked through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous in July of 1972, we had some very, very persuasive members of Alcoholics Anonymous. But I want to assure you that there was not one or all of them put together who could tell me as I sat there in those early days of Alcoholics Anonymous, hoping that as I walked down the street, that if I caught my reflection in a mirror, I wouldn't feel like throwing up. And that was all I was hoping for, that there would be a point where I would get to a place in Alcoholics Anonymous where I would not want to trade places with anyone else, most of all where I would not want to feel any different than I felt. I did not believe that that was possible in the entire world, you know. And I was amazed at the power of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'd love to be able to tell you that from that day to this, it's always been that way, but that's not true for me. There's days I'd rather be blonde or stacked, you know. But most of the time, I'm happy being who I am. And most of the time, even when there are some difficult things going on in my life, I don't want to trade places with anybody else. Because I know I'm on my own journey and my own path, and there have been so many different remarkable things that have happened that I never could have predicted. And that's why I say when I stand up here, I live a life I never would have wanted. And I am a person I wouldn't have even liked. You know, and it's just been a fascinating task. You know, I went ahead and I finished law school, and in order to finish law school and practice law, you have to pass the bar exam. And so after law school, you know, I began to study for this very long test. And I worked very, very hard, and I kept my AA commitments, and I studied all the time, and I did all the classes, and I did all the work that was required, and I paid the money for the tests, and I went down there, and I took the 3-day, 24-hour exam, and I went home, and, you know, I began to just do my work, and, you know, the part-time job that I had while I waited to find out if I'd passed the bar. And in November of 1982, I received a telegram telling me that I did not pass the bar exam. And I could not believe it. I could not believe it. I could not have done 5 seconds more of work. There was not one thing I could have done that I could see differently. And I could not believe it. I was 10 years sober, and I had enough money in the bank to pay my rent on December 1st, and that was it. I didn't have $1 for the basket. I didn't have money for gas in my car. I couldn't buy myself, you know, a jar of peanut butter, and I felt like such a failure in Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, and I mean, it was just sort of, you know, I thought, I'm 10 years sober. I mean, aren't I supposed to be taking newcomers out for steak dinners, for Christ's sake? You know, and I would come home from meetings, and there would be, you know, a bag on my porch. And there'd be some hamburger and peanut butter and potatoes and, you know, and bread. And I just couldn't believe it. I thought, I am 10 years sober. You know, when am I going to be able to give back something? You know, I was just mortified that I was just such a failure, and I could not, you know, participate in a financial way in Alcoholics Anonymous. And yet, you know, the longer I'm sober, the more grateful I am for a person like me that I was not able to pay my way financially in Alcoholics Anonymous. Because I was always the kind of person where if you put $1 in the basket and I couldn't put $1 in the basket, I did $5 of work in that meeting because I didn't want anybody there thinking that I wasn't doing something to be in that seat. And I've been overpaid countless times. But anyway, so I was there, and I remember I got a 12-step call, you know, right then. And I went over and I picked up this woman. She was kind of drunky-poo, you know. And I brought her over to my house, and, you know, we talked for a while, and then I took her to a meeting, and I brought her back to my house. And we were sitting there, and she began to cry. She was kind of sober by this time. She began to cry, and she said, I don't have a job. And I said, neither do I. She said, I don't have enough money to pay my rent. Neither do I. You know, she's like, how long are you sober? It's like 10 years, but it's really a good program, and really, you're really gonna, get a lot out of it. I just kept taking her, to meetings, and she did stay sober, and so did I. And it was sort of like, what Clancy was talking about last night, and this has happened to me a number of times, where it says in Alcoholics Anonymous in the book, when all else fails, try working with another alcoholic, and that was the best I could do, And I went out that night when I got that telegram, and I went out with my best friend, and Mike, and he's got 9 days and 1 year more than I do. And we went out that night when I got that telegram, and I told him, I said, Mike, I said, you know what that telegram means? It means it is not God's will. It means that this was some stupid little idea that I had, that I could leave the streets of Venice and go on and become a lawyer. This was ridiculous. It was insane. And I said I should just go ahead and just be a waitress and give all this stuff up. And that is what this telegram says, Mike. It says it's not God's will. And he said, well, let me see that telegram. And he says, I think it says you're supposed to take the test again. And I said, no, it doesn't. I said, Mike, do you realize I owe thousands of dollars that I've borrowed? Thousands of dollars. I don't even have a job, and they won't hire me now because I didn't pass this test. He said, well, borrow some more. Take it again. I said, well, all right. And so I did, and I took the test again. And in February of 1980, actually I was off a year, that was 83, so February of 84, I received a telegram saying that I did pass the California bar exam. And I have to tell you that spiritually I felt much better about my programmed life in AA on that day, And I'd like to be able to tell you it was the same either way, but I'm sorry, This was a lot easier. But I didn't think of drinking or killing myself. And from where I came from, that's almost an impossibility, when I got that telegram. Those weren't even options on my list anymore at that time, I went ahead and I got a job, and it was a job that I loved very, very much. And most of the time as I, did that job, I saw people on a daily basis that were in places where I should have been, and they were in jails, and they were on their way to prison, and some of them used to be in meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, and some of them I had known from my home group even, and so it was a constant reminder to me of where people like me end up, if they don't continue to do the things that are asked of us here in Alcoholics Anonymous. And and I worked really hard at that job, and I was thinking about it this morning, after I'd been in that job for maybe about 5 years. Two of my supervisors called me in, and they asked me if I would work on the training program, because they wanted me to pass on to the new lawyers that we were hiring the kind of enthusiasm and work product that I was doing. And I thought, basically they want to put me in this job because of my attitude. Now I want to tell you, in 1972, no one thought I would get a job someday for my attitude, I came to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I was single. And today I think that when you're 13, that's a good thing. But back then I didn't necessarily think so. My mother had never been married, and I sort of always thought, that if she had, maybe things would have been really different. And so I really had this, this idea of, having the perfect relationship. And if you get sober in Alcoholics Anonymous and you're single, I have some very bad news for you. At least it was bad news for me. And that is that you're probably going to have to date. I would much rather fall in love, and I usually did. I'm the kind of person on the way to the coffee pot, I'll fall in love. And if he comes to the meeting the next night with another woman, I think he's being unfaithful. But if you do get sober and you're single, you're probably going to have to date. Now, we have these dates in LA. I don't know if you guys have them here, but it's where a guy will ask you out, and then he'll take you to a meeting. Where else would you go? And then after the meeting, he'll take you to coffee, and you talk about the meeting, and by the time you get home, you don't know whether to say the Lord's Prayer or kiss him goodnight, And so I've had a lot of those kind of dates. I remember one that was particularly notable, which was I was sitting at the coffee stage of my date, and the guy said, I really like you. And I said, thanks. He said, I think you're really nice. And I said, well, thank you. And he said, but I like your friend at the next table better. Do you mind if I go sit with her? And I thought, well, no, not at all. And I went home and thought things through, which is one of the reasons that my sponsors have always been able to convince me that I've never yet had a problem that's been as bad as my solution for it. But I just thought things through for several hours, and I got up the next morning and I realized there was only one solution, and I went down and I tried to join the United States Air Force. And the Air Force wouldn't take me, and so then I called my sponsor. That's what I recommend. If the Air Force won't take you, you might want to try calling your sponsor. And I can remember, getting my heart broken. I guess I'll tell this real quick. I mentioned that I was suicidal before coming to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that didn't really go away, again, just from getting sober. But ultimately, it was to leave, and actually it was when I talked to Chuck Chamberlain that I just was able to hear, like he used to say, I was able to hear what I needed to hear. But I was a couple years sober before I went down there to talk to him about, this desire that I had to die rather than to go forward. I got involved in this, relationship in AA, and we never took a 30-day trip together. We were never able to stay together that many days. But we went out like that for 2.5 years, and during that time, there were a lot of times where I would be at his house and other people would come over, and so I would have to go hide in the closet. And sometimes we would go to meetings, and we'd go to the same meeting, and he'd say, now you come in 15 minutes after I am, and don't let anybody know that you know me, and that's what I would do. And I was so grateful that this guy would let me hide in his closet. That's just really kind of where I was at, in my life. Anyway, and then he left me. He broke up with me. And as I sat there that day, I thought, I'm going to have to kill myself, because I've never experienced pain like this. This is unbelievable. And I don't know how to deal with pain like this. And I don't want to drink or use, so I'm going to have to kill myself. And I realized that was really the only solution. And right then, there was a knock at my door. And I went over to the door, and it was this guy named Bob, who was helping at Central Office that I had met there. And he said, hi. He said, are you ready to go tonight? What are you talking about, Bob? He said, remember I told you I'm taking this panel over to Santa Monica City College, and you told me that, you'd go with the public relations thing for Central Office and tell them a little bit about AA and alcoholism. And I said, Bob, I'm really sorry here. I said, but experience, strength, and hope I don't have. I was just going to kill myself. I really don't think I should go on your panel. And he said, have you eaten dinner? I said, no. He said, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you come, let's get something to eat. He said, then I'll do the panel, you can come with me, but you don't have to say anything, and then I'll bring you home, and you can kill yourself. And I'm like, all right. So we drove along, and I didn't talk to Bob, and I wouldn't let him play the radio. Because, if you start to talk to somebody, you could get distracted and begin to feel better. And you don't want to do that. If you're going to really feel the pain, you have to concentrate. So I was concentrating on the pain and not only experiencing the pain of the moment, but if you want to really experience all pain, and you do need good concentration for this, you have to concentrate on the fact that not only has this person left, but there will never be anyone again. And if you don't get there, you're missing a lot of the pain. So I was really, working on that. And finally we pulled up at the panel, and we were walking through the parking lot, and I was deep in pain. And a stranger walked up to me and said, do you know where room 347 is? And I said, no. And she said, well, would you help me find it? I thought, all right. So I wandered her around the school, got her lost, and as we were wandering around, she began to talk to me, and she said, I'm taking a theater class. And I go, great. I give very short answers when I'm in pain. And she said, well, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm with some people, and, we're on this panel, and we're going to talk a little bit about, alcoholism. She goes, really, for it or against it? So I guess you'd say against it. I've never really heard of any talks for alcoholism, And she said, really? She said, I'm on the wagon. And I said, really? I said, I've known a lot of people on the wagon. They usually fall off. But that's great. She said, well, why would you be giving that kind of a talk? And I said, because I'm an alcoholic, and I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I stay sober one day at a time. Would you like to go to a meeting? And she said, yes, she would. And we traded phone numbers, and obviously I couldn't go home and kill myself. She'd think AA didn't work. And I took her to a meeting the next night, and she was not to stay sober at that time, but she's sober today, and she has over 23 years sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, and she has every bit as much to do with my still being sober today as I did, anything to do with her being sober. But anyway, long after that, and after a lot of AA dates, etc., this guy in law school asked me out, and I didn't really want to go out with him because he didn't have any tattoos, he'd never been in jail. I just didn't know if we could work things out, with someone with that kind of a background. But we began to go out, and we fell in love, and we dated for a really long time. But anyway, we eventually decided to get married, and in 1988 we got married, and when we got married, every member of my family was there. Some of the members of my family came from another country who had never even been to this country to represent my grandparents. Most of the members of my family had to pay money in order to be able to be there. Not a lot, but they had to buy a ticket from somewhere, to be able to be there. And I didn't wish I was anywhere else. I didn't wish I was marrying anybody else. I didn't wish I came from any other place, and I could not believe that Alcoholics Anonymous could have made that possible for me. And my husband had always really wanted to have children, and I did not want to have children. I was sure that I could not have children because from the time that I was 15 in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I had had many, many surgeries and seen many, many doctors who told me that I needed a hysterectomy because of the damage that I had done to my body. And they said there wasn't any way to correct it. It was just a question of waiting until I was over 18 so I could have that hysterectomy. But anyway, I went ahead and I had not had the hysterectomy. I never had insurance. I couldn't have paid for it. I couldn't put $1 in the basket, so I couldn't do that. And so I just kept showing up, and here we were married, and we decided to try, and we got some medical help, and we ended up getting pregnant, and I had a miscarriage, and then we got pregnant again, and I had a little baby girl named Samantha. And I couldn't believe it, And then, like 6 months after Samantha was born, I was very, very sick. I had a bad case of the flu. Only when I got to the doctor, they said it wasn't the flu. I was pregnant again. Just couldn't believe it, Of course, I am Catholic, and what Clancy says about that. But anyway, I was raised Catholic. I guess you just can't get it out of your system, no matter what. So, anyway, a few months later, I had my little daughter Jessica, and about a little over 2.5 years ago, I had my daughter Cassandra, and so now I have Sammy, Jesse, and Casey, and I just can't believe it. It wasn't even on my list, and I'll tell you, anybody who's been a parent knows that there are joys beyond your wildest imagination. But I'll also tell you that sometimes if I was sponsoring these kids, I would tell them they needed to work with someone else every once in a while because geez, they just don't always listen the way that they should. I want to tell you this one little spiritual story that I read, and then I think I'm going to go ahead and sit down. I like to read different little books. I'm not a member of any type of religion. That hasn't ever been comfortable for me. But I like to read different things about different religions, and I like to read like little stories. I've always been a story person. It's one of the things that helps me so much about meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous and tapes and things like that. And so I like to read some little story on Gandhi one day and something else that Confucius said, and I just had this little book like that. I read this story about Gandhi not all that many months ago, and what it was Gandhi was running to catch a train, and when he was almost at the train, he kind of tripped, and one of his sandals came off, and it stayed there, and then he had to run, and he jumped on the train, and when he got on the train, he took off his other sandal, and he threw it back to where the first one was. And some of his followers said, what are you doing? And he said, I figured if a man came along and he found one shoe, it would be of no value to him. But since one shoe was of no value to me, I thought if I left two, he would have an opportunity to do something with them. And I thought about that, and I just thought, well, boy, I'm not there. If I lose one earring, I'm like looking everywhere. I'm pissed. Sometimes I have to pray. I have to call my sponsor. I have to tell at least 20 people at my home group about the earring and how I can't find it, And I just thought, that never even occurred to me to just throw the other earring, somewhere. But I thought about this story periodically. About 2 months ago, I was picking up my kids at school, and, we're running along and, to get in the car so we can get home and do homework and, so we can get the basketball and brownies and all the different places that my life takes me down. And, we're getting in the car and Jessica is climbing in, and, as she's getting in my big truck, she's climbing up there, her shoe comes off. Not a big deal. I bend over to pick up her shoe, but unfortunately, there's a storm gutter there. and her shoe fell in the storm gutter. Now, I can't believe this. You know, I'm trying to lay on the street and look down there to see if I can even see the shoe. It's so far down. And she says, Mom, I'm sorry. She said, should I throw the other one in there? I thought, I'm living with Gandhi. You know, I thought, geez. Anyway, you know, one of the things that, you know, Clancy talked about how in hindsight, sometimes, you know, it seems like you saw the answer or you saw what was going on. And I think that if there is a problem or a flaw that, you know, that has come up in Alcoholics Anonymous with the sense of why so many people leave, because the program of Alcoholics Anonymous can be excruciatingly slow sometimes. I can't believe how slow my progress has been sometimes and how disappointed I am with where I should be. You know, and I think that sponsors are critical for that kind of thing in helping you know where you should or shouldn't be, and that kind of thing, and taking away that, you know, that thing that we, you know, kind of beat ourselves up with. And you know, one of the things is that I really believe in Alcoholics Anonymous that we all have long, dark hallways to go down. I don't know when yours are going to come up. I don't know when mine are going to be next, but I think we're all going to have them. And I know today, you know, that a lot of miracles have come for me. That doesn't mean I enjoy the hallway. I'm not there yet, you know. But there really have been a lot of things that have happened that I never expected. And so what I wish for you today, if you're sitting out there and you're in one of those long, dark hallways, whether you're new or whether you've been sober a really long time, is I hope you won't give up before your miracles happen. I have no idea, you know, what your miracles are going to be, just as I have no idea what mine are going to be. But I really hope that you'll keep coming back and that you won't drink, and that you'll work with someone else and you'll try these principles, and that you'll wait for your miracle to happen. Thank you for letting me be part of your conference.